This is the first time in history that someone's actually drawn what the second coming of Christ will look like when Jesus returns to earth. In this painting, Jesus stands in the clouds with his arms open wide. He has long flowing hair. He wears a beautiful red robe and he glows from the inside out as he lets loose a golden-colored aura from his head. First, I drew a cloud shape where Jesus will stand in. Then I drew another large oval above his head for the bright glow he will emit. Next, I drew his arms spread out to the sides with smaller circles for the hands. Finally, I drew the robes with some simple lines. I made them have a fluffy appearance by adding light lines throughout them. I used a smaller paintbrush to add finer details to the light pattern. I also gave them dark outlines to make them pop out more from the bright background. I made his chest a bit darker than the rest of his body, giving it some much-needed contrast. I started off by adding small, curved lines shooting out from the top of his head. I used a smaller brush to add finer detail, creating a bright burst of energy. This helped balance out the composition since there was now a lot more going on in the foreground. I added a few white stars closer to Jesus to bring attention to the main focus of the piece. Also, if you'd like to see more videos like this, I'll leave a link to my other religious paintings in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. God bless. I went back in and darkened the left side of his robe, since it was getting a bit too light. I also added more detail to the background clouds. I mixed yellow, orange, and white to create a goldenrod color for the aura. I added thicker lines radiating out from the center of the energy burst. I also added a few swirls to the design to give it more character. I added fine lines throughout his arms and hands to give them more definition. With this, I added thinner lines throughout the aura. This helped add more depth to the entire piece and tied together the background and the foreground. I made the top half a bit darker than the bottom half, adding some much-needed contrast. I also added some fine detail to the background, making it more interesting. I then added a white circle to the center of the energy burst, letting loose a blinding light. This symbolized the light that will shine from within him when Jesus returns to earth. I used a smaller paintbrush to add finer details to the edge of the aura, letting it fade out into the background. I added more swirling lines to the center of the aura, making them thinner towards the outer edges. I mixed black with a bit of the goldenrod color to create a dark brown. With this, I added some very fine lines throughout the aura, giving it some much-needed texture and definition. I added more fine detail to the burst of energy, making it the focal point of the entire piece. I also added fine lines to his hair, as well as his face and neck, to give them more texture. I made his eyes sparkle by adding 2 bright yellow stars inside of them. I added a bright yellow star above his head to act as a preview of the bright glow he will let loose later. I then added in his long flowing hair. I made it look wild and unruly by adding lots of thick lines throughout it. I shaded the tops of the locks to give them some depth. I also added a few highlights to the tips of his hair to make them pop out more. I mixed dark blue and black to make a dark purple for his robe. I added simple lines throughout it to make it look draped and flowing. I made the top portion of the robe tighter and the bottom portion wider to give it some more form. I then added a lighter strip along the side of the robe to give it some dimension. I made the left side of the robe darker than the right side, since the right side would get more light hitting it. I also added light lines to the folds of the robe to make it look textured and 3D. I also added some very thin, wispy lines throughout.
The rest of the background to add more depth and movement to the piece.
I made these thinner lines curve and swirl to add visual interest to the background. The clouds and sky are filled with stars and shine with different shades of white, yellow, and blue. I chose to make his skin tone glowy and bright by mixing yellow, white, and a bit of green. I started by adding in the face, neck, and chest. I made his face appear a bit translucent, so you can see the light shining through his body. His eyes were the brightest part of his skin. Since they were the only ones showing any color, I gave them a yellow glow and added some sparkle to his eye. I gave him a slight smile and made the skin under his eyes a bit darker to give him some much-needed contrast. Light bursts from the heavens above him as he slowly opens his arms. The camera then rotates slowly around him as soft angelic music plays. I got the idea for this piece from a book called The Greatest Story Ever Told by Fulton Oursler. It's an older book from 1949, which I found in our local library. I absolutely love the cover art of this edition. It shows Jesus coming back in the clouds with open arms, letting loose a blinding light as it shines through the darkness. I started off this piece by sketching the basic shapes. For the background, I started filling in the clouds with soft brush strokes. I added dark outlines to the edges of the clouds to make them pop out from the background. For the sky, I mixed black, blue, and purple to give it a nighttime feel. Then I started adding small white dots throughout the background for stars. I chose mostly small stars, since most of the brightness will be focused on Jesus, to help give the stars some dimension. I darkened the center of each one, making them look a bit more 3D. Next, I began adding light coming from the top of the clouds in thin, wispy lines. I varied my brush size to give the light a softer feel, as if it was being created by the movement of a brush. I added in more wisps and used thicker lines to show more light coming from directly above his head. I continued rotating the canvas as I painted to make sure the light pattern would flow all the way around him. I made the light a bit brighter towards the center of the clouds and let it fade out towards the edges. This gave it a bit more of a celestial feel, as if the light was really coming from within the clouds themselves. I added more white and yellow tones to the center of the light pattern to give it a bit more brightness. Then I started adding in more detail to the background clouds. Next, I added in the figure of Jesus himself. I then added in his hands and arms. These had a similar glow to his face, but not quite as bright. And next, I added the final touches to his skin. Now it was time to start on the gold-colored aura, or what some may call the Shekinah glory, that Jesus will emit when he returns. I mixed light blue and white to create a sky blue color. Next, I went back in and added even smaller stars to the background, covering up the larger ones that I had added in previously. Finally, I added a bright white oval behind the burst of energy, giving it more of a celestial feel. This took me about 8 hours over the course of 3 days to complete. I hope you enjoyed watching me create this piece. If you did, please consider subscribing.